are stuck in an ideological rut. And programs like yours, popular as they are, haven't helped. And I
Disagree.
I said the same thing to
I
O'Reilly,
disagree.
and I've said the same thing of Rachel Maddow's program.
I disagree with you.
Do you?
Yes, because Americans know Sean Hannity is a conservative.
Yeah.
There's no pretense here. I'm not Ted Koppel.
Right.
I am a person, it's branded. This is a conservative show.
Yeah.
Do you think there are many people in America that don't know I have a point of view that's conservative or that Rachel is a liberal?
That's not my point.
So that's the editorial page of a newspaper. Do you against the editorial pages?
No, I'm against the editorial pages taking over from the front page.
Okay, that's a good response.
I'm against the editorial page becoming the economic engine,
Well,
the economic engine of the network.
We have to give some credit to the American people that they're somewhat intelligent and that they know the difference between an opinion show and a news show.
Yeah.
You're cynical. Look at that. Yeah.
I am cynical because, you know.
You think we're bad for America? You think
Yeah.
I'm bad for America?
Yeah.
You do?
In the long haul, I think you
Really?
and all these opinion
That's
shows.
sad, Ted.
No, you know why?
That's sad.
Because you're very good at what you do, and because you have attracted a significantly
You
more
are selling the
influential.
American
let me
people
finish the
short.
Let me finish the sentence
I'm
before
listening.
you do that.
With all due respect.
Yes,
Take the floor.
you have attracted people who are determined that ideology is more important than facts.
Hello and welcome to the program. That was a clip to start us off for today's topic, which will be about news, opinion, and polarization. We aim to have a thoughtful discussion on how the objective reporting of news has been overshadowed more and more by opinion-oriented media, and as a result has led to more polarization in our society. But before we get started, let me welcome the panelists. Thank you everyone for being here today. Appreciate it. Thank you, Jeff. So let me start off with this to sort of set the stage for our discussion. I'm going to date myself a little bit. When I was a kid, there was no internet, there was no cable television. For news, there was newspapers and 3 major television networks. And the world news came on every evening for 30 minutes. If you missed it, well, you missed it. I remember in our household we watched Walter Cronkite, and he delivered the news in a very straightforward manner, as the other 2 networks did as well. And what was interesting is during this time there were 3 networks, so they played to the broadest audience possible. And more importantly, news then was seen as a public service provided by the TV networks that weren't expected to make a profit. They had the entertainment side of their programming for that. So it was a public service, and this sort of evolved out of the old radio days when they had the same, before television, when they had the same sort of setup. And so this worked rather well, and you could argue during those decades that we had objective reporting. Then in the 1990s, cable television became commonplace, the internet took hold, you had talk radio, and so people had many different sources to get information from. And as a result, it sort of scattered the masses to all these different sources that were trying to get their attention. And so the news did become profit-driven. But not only that, news media began to market to certain segments of the population, certain audiences, based on ideology, because they could corner a market on ideology and sell advertisement. There was money to be had. And so we got less news and more opinion. But not only that, we also got theater and entertainment in this sort of sense, but of kind of the ugly kind that sometimes stokes the worst of human nature, of fear, hate, misunderstanding, hostility towards those who don't share your viewpoint. And so it has led, I believe, to more polarization of our society. And so that's where we find ourselves now. And I look at that clip with Koppel, and you know, he makes a point. He's interviewing Sean Hannity of Fox, but it could easily be a person from CNN or MSNBC or an internet-based news source. And so how do we fix that? And I have a few clips we're going to watch today as we dig into this topic, and one of them discusses how do we fix this, and we can see if we can get any thoughts on that. But that's where we are. So that sort of sets the stage. I'm just going to go around. I'll try to get everyone's initial thoughts on this topic, and then we'll dig into the conversation. Brian, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts, your reflections?
My reflections, I love this topic, first off.
Yeah.
I remember growing up, I remember growing up watching the news. Everything was, straightforward. I also remember, newspapers. I remember, my parents always get the newspaper. My parents read the same news that my neighbors read, that everyone else in the whole neighborhood read. So we were all reading the same stuff. We all have the same information. Nowadays, even if you open up a, Facebook or some other internet-based, news service, the news I get is different than the news from everyone else gets, because it's going to be, algorithmed for what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And it's, with what Ted was saying, I definitely agree with him too. It's, it's ideological. It's like having an echo chamber for people who have, I just want to hear stuff that validates my opinions. And
Right.
it's, I'm not a huge fan of the way the news is basically presented nowadays. I usually get more out of watching news from, foreign sources like BBC, just because they seem to be more true to the idealisms of journalism.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
What about you, Mike?
Well, the problem now, and again, it wasn't a problem back in the day where there was no internet cable news, where you did have specific stories that were covered by the three networks. Now it's all profit driven, because you look at some of these talk shows where it's an opinion, but you have people, that's their only source of news.
Right.
So if you talk to some of these people, they don't even know what's going on as far as factual issues. They're just saying whoever the commentator is, that's what they believe. So there's no checking for the source of where this is coming from. There's really no controls over some of these shows that are on it, whether it's even, look at YouTube. There's no controls on any of these so-called news sources. So someone could say anything on social media that maybe a group of people are watching, that the audience starts to grow,
Right.
and that's what they're getting for news. Even though it's not news, it's an opinion. It could be some subject that's not even a relevant subject anymore. So it's really frustrating. And like Brian said, I try to look at different sources for news.
Yeah.
BBC is one of them, PBS. But some of the other, opinion shows, they're just opinions. So sometimes it's just foolishness. But I know people personally, but that's their source of news all the time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. What are your thoughts, Karen?
Yeah, it's definitely a provocative subject. It's one I think about a lot, actually, each morning when I look at news. And I tend to get most of my news from the internet, as far as I don't really watch a lot of television. But what I try to do each morning is go to a lot of different sources. So I'll go to the Drudge Report. I'll go to MSNBC. I'll go to BBC, which, as you mentioned, Brian, BBC seems like very reputable and not so opinion-based. That's the one, if something's happening in the world, I'll usually go to BBC. It's like, all right, what's really happening? But then I'll also check a variety of sources on Facebook,
Yeah.
see what they're saying about things, and from there end up coming up with somewhat of a conclusion on a particular story, what's happening. I also grew up in the time of the television with the dial that only really
Right.
had
Me too.
3 stations, maybe 4 if you had the PBS.
You move the rabbit ears.
Rabbit ears, you could get Creature Double Feature on
Yeah.
Channel
Yeah.
38. And I assumed that was everything, growing up that way. This is what news is. And it's amazing to think about younger people growing up and their only source of news is this way, the profit-driven in essence. It's like, where do you get your news that is real? So it's a question that I'm looking forward to delving into more in our discussion here.
Right. Tim?
Yeah, I think, just kind of listening to you all, I think it's sort of a unique viewpoint in that, so I'm born in '85, so I kind of grew up with this, right? There was no 3 channels. It was already cable news, and everything kind of has gotten more, I would say, more and more extreme, or just like pushed in a more entertainment direction as I've gotten older. But it's always been that way, right? To me, and particularly with television news, right? So as that's kind of evolved, I think you have this point where I grew up with the internet, right? It comes out, and I'm just growing up with it there, and it's this. We'll get into this, I think, at some point, but that democratization of the news sources. And so, as a person today, I look mostly online, and it's mostly through Reddit, right? Like, I'm getting my news through that channel, the social media, but it's from a variety of sources because it's just one user putting it up and another user fact checking it, right? And it's such a different way of getting news. But it also requires, I think, the user to have a massive responsibility of checking that stuff. Because kind of what you guys are talking about, if you're sitting there watching television, it's going to be that extreme. You might get not extreme, but a viewpoint that is more for entertainment, more of an opinion. And the internet, same problem, but it's different. You get someone might say something with all kinds of like strength, right, of their words, but actually turns out that's completely false, right? Like that was not actually true. So someone goes, right, the next line below that says, next comment below that says, like, this is completely wrong, here's why, right? And so you have this other different thing going on, but it's the same problem. You can also find yourself in those echo chambers where everybody is piling on, right, one viewpoint, and just now they're just saying, wow, look how smart we are, right?
Right.
So it's just interesting to kind of have that viewpoint of it. It's a little different, I think, than what you guys were commenting on, but similar challenges, right, of finding those echo chambers and being stuck in them.
Yeah. Yeah, you always hear with communication that, as a species, if we can just communicate more, we'd be better, because there'd be more understanding. But here's an example where we got more outlets because of technology to communicate, and it's just become more divisive. And there's a quote I always liked. It said that we are living in an age where we are drowning in information but starving for knowledge. And it just seems that's really interesting. You're like, oh yeah, if we can just communicate more, it's going to solve problems. Actually, it's creating problems. And I think, and we'll go into a clip on this in a little bit, but I think part of it is there used to be professional editors, and it was who edited the news, and it was fact-based. But we'll kind of go into this democratization of the news. But now, if anybody anywhere on a website or any cable channel can just sort of spout what they think is news, but is actually opinion.
Or like even you select a person who's in the entertainment industry as an editor, right, to spice up the news.
Right.
And that can also be like the same thing.
And it's like, well, that's not news. That's some of that's sensationalism. Some of that is attracting ratings. But the news should be just sort of a fact-based blah, 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 blah. And, this is what you're looking at. I'll give you an example. When in 2015, my wife and I were going to go to Paris for our honeymoon. And the day before, they had those attacks in Paris. And so people were watching the news here in the States, and it looked, it's just like this constant, they show the same clips over and over, like, the world is coming to an end kind of thing, like, oh my gosh, that's just so terrible. And it's just like fear, 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 and it's just like splashed across the screen. And people were telling us, don't go. Oh, it's too dangerous, don't go. We went, and it was completely different than what we were seeing on the news here. It was very calm. There was no like, it was, there was a somberness in the city, but things went about their day, and there wasn't sort of this chaotic, what we saw splashed across the scenes over and over again. And I remember watching the news over there, on where we were, they had an English version of it. It was the BBC, and it was just very blah, 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 today in Paris. It wasn't like here. I was like, you're everything in the world, And I realized, that's marketing. They're trying. Please keep watching us. But that's not news. That's profit-driven, and a lot of it is opinion. Be afraid.
It's so true. Some of these stations, you'll see. Breaking news for the small percent, right?
Yes.
That phrase, they should get fined whenever they use that if it's not actually breaking news.
Everything's a squirrel was caught in the attic of the mayor's home. Film at 11. It's just like
Yeah.
Even the meter of that, like they'll
Yeah.
put up the breaking news thing, but they let it stay a little while so you can really get anxious about, oh no,
Like,
all right,
what
what
bad thing, yeah.
country exploded today, and then
Yeah.
it's, something small often, or
Dinosaurs were real.
yeah.
All right, really?
yeah, but what that's one thing because it's kind of silly and so forth. But the part that's not silly is this sort of the ugliness we're seeing now. The last 10, 20 years now, with especially cable TV news and also with internet-based news source. It's just opinion-based, and it's become sort of an ugly theater, and it's sort of to get joy out of like, oh, we burnt the other side, that's not news. But a lot of people, just like you said, you grew up outside of the era that I grew up in, so I've seen the other side. The other side was better. I sound like an old man, don't I? You damn kids in the news!
Yeah,
But
it becomes like a competitive sport, as
Yeah.
people say,
Yes.
right? To take a win on something that's like,
But
what is it's all
Right.
relative, instead of it being sort of. And I don't want to go down this road with the objective versus subjective stuff just yet, but I would say like a more objective viewpoint, a more balanced viewpoint.
Right.
Know? So I think that's definitely part of the problem.
But also, depending upon the news outlet, you could have something big could happen in the world. A nuclear explosion in a country, and a specific station may choose to air something else because that's what they're pushing for that week.
right.
Whether
Which
it's
is
a hunter's
really
laptop and
crazy.
something else, where it's so it becomes like a balancing act of what's really the important story here.
Right.
Even though it could be factual, the story they're pushing, but it's not
Right.
really.
It's selective, right?
Yeah.
You even see that on your local news. Like there's the Sinclair Broadcast Group, and they own or operate nearly 200 stations across the country, and they have a conservative bent. It's partisan. You can see sort of a partisan politics at play here, and it's the weirdest thing because you'll be watching your local news and it's local stories, and like in the middle, right before or after the weather, it's usually this rogue story that is sort of splash has nothing to do with your local area, but it's sort of this obligated video because they're a Sinclair. This is my belief. Is they're obligated to show this video, and it's just so you can see. Oh, well, there's a slant here, and what the heck is this? This has nothing to do with our area, but
Right.
why are you pushing this?
I've seen a video like that where they said, "Hey,
Yeah,
here's
they
this-
had all the-
all the individual."
John Oliver. John
that what it was?
Oliver.
Yeah, he
he
did
did a
something
segment
on
on
that,
that
yeah.
where he literally had overlaid, I think it was almost like 30 or 40 of those news stations.
Gosh.
And actually, they were saying the exact same words.
Yeah.
It was,
Even locally, Channel 10,
Yeah.
they're on, right. And I understand there's going to be a company that owns many news, but if you have agenda, that's not what it should be about. If the idea is you're going to report the news and the weather, leave it at that. Why do you have to have agenda?
Right.
Yeah, good
Yeah,
question.
that's more insidious than not, like,
Yeah.
hey, if it's wearing it on its sleeve and, you got your echo chamber situation, where we're ignoring a story, that's one thing. But to put what people would typically think is a local news station with, then blend in this, like, sort of corporate ownership,
Right.
that starts to become a much different beast, and probably what you're getting at with
Yeah.
this discussion, it's a bigger issue to have that type of profit-driven
Right.
viewpoints and entertainment value.
And, it's just, I see it on the world news and I see it on the local news. And this is the difference between if you watch BBC or PBS versus network news, or even in the local markets, your local news. They start out with that dramatic music at the beginning, tonight, and it's usually very like, be afraid,
Yes.
tonight, the killings, and blah, blah, blah. And you're just like,
It is like that.
and their voice is heightened, and, it's almost like they're not yelling, but they're just, it's like, whereas you watch PBS and it's like, blah, 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 blah. And, so they start out with this, and by the end of the news, they always do that sort of soft, where they can joke or laugh around story, and that's how cotton candy's made. See you at the fair. Total difference from the beginning, like, your life is over.
Yeah.
And now, see you at the fair. It's just like,
Capture their attention, and then
Exactly. It's like, now that you've spent that time with us, now we're going to make you feel better so you'll come back. So you can be afraid and then know that we'll take care of you
We're
with
here for you,
exactly.
yes.
our safe, happy, at the end fluff story.
It's almost like a church sermon. It's like you build a crowd up and you let them down. You build them up some more. Hey, give us some money, by the way, and then you let them down.
Yes, yes.
Keep watching for the advertisements, please.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we have a clip we're going to watch. This is with Timothy Ferris. He is a science writer. He was a journalist. I think he was editor at Rolling Stone for one time, and he was a professor. He taught journalism. So this is an interesting clip. He uses a newspaper in this lecture that he gives, and I think it actually gives a nice background to the sense of things, and we can talk about it. So let's take a look.
Hi everyone, Timothy Ferris here with a few words about news. I'm going to define news as fresh information that people in a given audience need to know or want to know. Sometimes the two are combined if there's a hurricane bearing down on your community, but it's also an editor's or a producer's responsibility to give prominence to news that the audience needs to know, even if they don't necessarily want to know it. I'd like to start with a medium that's becoming obsolete but tells us a lot about the nature of journalism, and that's the daily newspaper. I realize that newspapers printed on paper are on their way out, and that digital readership more and more is the case. But this is a technology that started back in around 1609. Newspapers evolved over the years a structure that regular readers learned to recognize. The story on the top right, for instance, is what the editors consider to be the most important news of the day. The one on the top left, the second most. And then one goes on down below the fold, as it used to be called. Better, stronger news here, less immediate down here. The placement of these stories on through the paper are editorial judgments by professional journalists. One of the problems I have with digital sites, including the New York Times digital site, is that they seem to be driven by algorithms that are, in my opinion, overly concerned with what the audience comes into the website already wanting to know. And that turns out to be largely opinions. The op-ed page opinions seem to be a very important or popular part of the New York Times, whereas from a news standpoint, they could be discarded. The New York Times decades ago didn't even have an op-ed page. When you go to the digital world, you find that these opinion pieces have bubbled up to the top as if they were on the front page of the paper here, which isn't where they belong. Opinions are not terribly important. One doesn't really have to have any opinions at all. What matters are facts. Now, a growing number of people are getting their news, or what they call the news, from the internet, where falsehoods spread 6 times faster than facts, and where there's always a site that will confirm your instincts or your opinions, but very few relative to the many amateur sites that will give you any fresh information or a logical basis for these opinions. So the internet as a whole is a wildly unreliable source of news. The cable news, 24-hour news broadcasts that you get with basic cable are pretty weak broth. And so I want to suggest 2 things that are just a matter of my opinion, my experience as a journalist and a writer, and that is, first, get your news from professional sources. And second, try to read as much as you can, because reading comprehension counts for so much more than just hearing something. And don't let anybody tell you not to. If a politician or a business person tells you that the real news, the professional news, is fake, or that you can't trust this newspaper or that newspaper, that the Times is too far to the left, or the Journal's too far to the right, or there's something wrong with this or that other source. They're not trying to tout you on to better news sources. They're trying to get you to not learn any news at all, because then it's very easy to manipulate you. Get your news from professional journalists. Consuming free news only is like saying, I'll only wear free shoes. Embarrassing, uncomfortable, and unlikely to get you very far. Hey, thanks for listening. See you next time.
Well, there you have it.
I like that.
There's some very interesting points in there. The professional editor making judgment calls about what is news. Also, about an editor's job is to tell you news that you might not necessarily want to hear. But, you know, you can see that from the old newspaper days, how that was important. He talked about a lot of things and how it's becoming, people go online and what they're looking for more is opinion versus news. But what are your guys' thoughts? Anybody on that clip? Opinion versus news, people seem to be going to
Well,
that.
he did talk about paying for your
Yeah.
news, and so we do get the Providence Journal at home, you know, the local newspaper. It is in a electronic format, but we pay for it. And
Yeah.
we find that that's a good source of news versus opinion. There's opinions too, but I think paying for something like that, I think is a good thing, because there's serious journalists that are writing that. I think they're tied in probably with USA Today and Boston Globe. They kind of combine
Yeah.
these newspapers, but still you get professional people who are reporting with some kind of standards versus just some YouTube website that somebody set up and said, this is the news, where it may be, but it may not be. So I think it's good to pay for something that pay for something that you have done some research on. You respect what's coming out of that outlet, and
Yeah.
it's a good thing. You're getting something that you're putting something into by getting your hard-earned dollars and say, okay, show me something that's most likely truthful. So
I agree. I still get the newspaper delivered, you know, and I probably should subscribe more to some of the newspaper media sites.
another thing I recommend, so we get the local newspaper. We also get magazine, The Economist,
Oh, yeah.
which, you know, is
Yeah,
telling
that's
you
very
about the
good.
whole world, and it's really good. We pay for it. Quite expensive. But I think it's worth it, because again, and we read it religiously. We really think we have some good knowledge on the world and what's going on. Some opinions, obviously, but I think it's good to be exposed to something like that versus free news on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that, I think even to the point of like, so I get, you know, Financial Times and New York Times, right, like as electronic, and it's nice my work actually pays for those, and I just have a subscription, so I actually am not paying for it, but somebody's paying for
Yes.
it, right? But whatever, the point being so full of white transparency there, I guess. But I will say that even if you're taking that or the journal or whatever, it's still it holds itself to what you're saying, like there's a higher standard for publishment in those places than a YouTube video, which is a very critical difference. Like in like that, hey, this website that has this information, you know, cigarettes are actually good for you, right, kind of thing. It's like, okay, well, who is checking those, right? No one. But these published, you know, news producers, when one leaning or another, do have actual standards, and you will find something in there that will, you know, get more to that objective view.
Yeah.
And also, another good one I found is that, weirdly enough, the newsletters come back around again.
Yeah.
So people are like getting email newsletters. So Axios is a website I've used. It's not even a website. I just get a newsletter, and you can get a variety of different, you know, published groups. You can do it for local, like I got one for Boston, and they only have a few city setups, but they have one for local, and then they have one for national, right? And they do this. They call it smart brevity, but it's basically just like, here's a synapse of
Very
what's
good.
going on. And I
Yeah.
actually really find it quite easy to digest. And again, it's a news site, right? But the other thing, and I don't want to pivot too hard here, but it's also like his call out to reading the news. Like
I was going to say, yeah, it's
so-
very important.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I know not everybody can do that, or you know, it's hard to stay focused on like reading a whole story sometimes. But I do prescribe to that being a super important part of intaking news, right?
Yes.
It's just more comprehensive. Like he said, you're getting a better understanding, whereas you get some sort of 30-second soundbite on a news or something like that. But here you're reading an article, and that clip was edited for time, but he was discussing the bottom fold of that New York Times page. And you remember that condo that collapsed in Miami? And there was a whole story on it, but it was in depth because they had investigative journalists, serious professional journalists. And everybody was trying to point the finger out, well, you know, it was the guy, it was this or that. it was really a combination of many things. It's not some clear-cut
Right.
thing. The association sort of let things go. The city didn't keep up. So it wasn't. There's nobody to blame. Everybody kind of was.
Right.
But it was it took a whole serious investigative journalism, and it was a very comprehensive article.
Right.
But that's what you get from reading,
And it's clear, like you just said, it's not one thing to blame.
Yeah.
And that complexity is, it's hard. I guess in our world today, it's hard for people to digest that, but it really is, right? Usually, it's more than just one thing that led to the problem. Well, I think it's this thing. Well, it's actually that thing. It's not. It's just
It's complexities,
Yeah.
which I think, as humans, we have problems. I'm always talking as humans, but we have problems.
By the way, we're human.
full transparency.
Well, I didn't want to say anything, but we want simple answers
Yes.
for complex problems, and you just are not going to get that.
Definitely, and I think his point about the newspapers and what you all have been saying as well about them. I read newspapers occasionally. What I do more is going to the news sites and reading the news on there. But watching that clip really brought up the point of growing up with, I grew up in Rhode Island, so we would get the Providence Journal, and particularly the Sunday Journal, just as a family sitting there reading the paper. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm just going to skim to this article, which is so easy to do on the internet. I mean, of course, you can do it in print as well, but on the internet, all of a sudden you get a like on something, you get a notification, and then you're jumping off the article. But there was something about sitting there an hour or two reading the newspaper.
Yeah.
And also the tactileness of it, the smell of it, the sound of the pages actually turning, and being in that full experience, which I think is sorely missing from the way that we...
I agree. I
Yeah.
remember
The really
that.
interesting thing, because I guess I experienced that too, right? Where it's like we get the Boston Globe, but it would be like in the Cape Cod Times. So it was like, right, we'd get these two papers, and it was like the families like sharing around this. Like that's such a you're kind of
Right,
right.
did
It's
you
kind of
see
unique,
this?
and like that just doesn't exist that way anymore.
Exactly, and that's also talks to the point of instead of allowing the news people, the professional news people, the in-depth, the investigative reporting, allow them to guide you through this story, not just picking that one paragraph and saying, well, I agree with that. That's got to be wrong, so I'm going to close that
Right.
paper, and I'm not going to look at that anymore. Like allowing yourself to immerse in the full experience of it.
The other thing, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of people, well, most of us in the world, we're so busy doing so many things, we don't take the time
Yep.
to look at news in depth, whether it's reading a newspaper, reading a magazine, and actually getting deep into a story and finding out things that the average person doesn't know. I have friends who they put their head in the sand. They don't watch the news. They don't read newspapers because it affects their life negatively. It's too much negative news out there. But if you're a voter, you're going to vote for the next presidential election or a local election. It's good to know what the hell is going on in this world. So when you make a decision to vote for someone, you know what's going on in the world and what they stand for. So it's a shame in a lot of ways.
Right.
That's all. It helps put things into perspective too. Like, oh man, I'm really having a rough day. But oh, out in Syria, they're in chaos right now.
Yeah.
The problem I'm having with weeds growing on your lawn, I guess it's really not all that important.
Yeah.
And I was even
Right.
thinking earlier too about, like, I heard this one quote. It was, you're either consuming the product or you are the product. And like when it comes to, like, paying for the news, I never really, really thought about it. So I'm actually kind of glad that that topic was kind of brought up here, where I'm like, yeah, that's right. I would never go on like some of those more off the wall websites, like advertisement. It's like looking up like recipes. Oh, I just want the recipe, but no, they give me this huge backstory behind like how they discovered this whole recipe. And it seems like a lot of news is kind of going down the similar path. It's like, oh, let me tell you the story behind this, not just the information or just the facts.
Right.
Interesting.
Very good. Well, we're going to watch another clip here. This one has Ted Koppel again. I think he's talking with Walter Isaacson, and this one's really interesting. He's going to talk about how the democratization of the news has actually the argument can be made is threatening democracy. And that might sound really weird. Well, if you democratize the news, what they mean is you have all these different sources that may not be up to the standards, and they might be pushing an agenda. But anybody with a laptop and a camera can now broadcast some news, I suppose. But that has actually threatened democracy in a way, and he goes into it a little bit. So let's take a look at that, and we'll see what your thoughts are.
Do you think that democracy is getting undermined by the fact that people are getting their news and information from more partisan and ideological sources?
I don't think democracy is being strengthened by it. Is it being undermined? Yes. I think that a democracy requires, desperately needs, what are widely perceived by people of all political stripes as objective sources of news. Otherwise, it's too easy to dismiss what is being said by one side or the other simply because they don't share your political point of view.
To what extent do you think that the internet and social media has exacerbated this problem?
Hugely. Hugely. I mean, I think the internet has been, the internet is on one level one of the greatest gifts to mankind that we can imagine. On another level, it is a weapon of mass destruction. It is the internet that has enabled people of extreme ideologies on the left and on the right to get in touch, not just with the half a dozen people sitting at the bar who may share their opinion, but all of a sudden, anyone with access to a laptop, anyone with access to an iPhone, has the capacity of becoming a publisher, a broadcaster, someone who potentially can reach hundreds, thousands. When you and I were young journalists, if you wanted to reach a large audience, you had to work for ABC or the New York Times or the Associated Press or UPI. It wasn't possible for an individual to put something out and make sure that it would reach tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people at a time. The internet makes that possible. That is both a blessing and a curse.
But isn't it in some ways not just a blessing, but it really democratizes as opposed to allowing gatekeepers like you and I once were to say, here's the news?
Yeah, and if you think the democratization of journalism is a good thing, I disagree with you. I don't
Why?
think it is. Because whether, you wouldn't dream of democratizing any other profession. You wouldn't democratize medicine. You wouldn't democratize the law. You wouldn't democratize plumbing or carpentry. You expect a certain level of expertise. You expect a carpenter to have had some training in his trade. I expect a journalist to have had some training in his trade. By the democratization of journalism, you make the process available to people who have absolutely no background in trying to present a fair, balanced point of view. None.
Do you think there's any way that the country gets back to what I guess you and I would call the old normal?
No. None. Not a chance.
So how does this movie go?
Well, I think we can only express a hope, a prayer even, that it doesn't go in the direction of violence.
Any thoughts on that one? That one's pretty heavy, and there's a lot there to unpack in a sense. Anybody can be, like you said, could become a publisher, and you can have an agenda, and it just leads to, I want to get into the polarization part. I really do think it just has us just battling each other. And what constructive thing does this do for our society? What do we get out of that? We're not really getting anything.
Yeah.
It's like the Civil War all over again. It's like us versus them. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I get all the people that want to be like me, and it's all their fault. And the other side is the exact same story too.
We need those gatekeepers
Yeah.
that are professionals, and there's going from an unbiased presentation. And we've just sort of gotten away from it.
I think one of the issues is the internet really has, I mean, I guess there's some regulations, but I think the government, needs to step in, just like they did when television first came out, where there's going to be certain rules. You should not be able to go on the internet and create a mini news station and start reporting something that maybe is so extreme you shouldn't even see it.
Right.
Yeah.
There has to be some kind of regulation. I
Yeah,
think that's the solution.
I would jump in on that and agree, because I think, so I don't want to get off again, but it's like, so Koppel, from my perspective, it's like he can sound a little bit like yelling at the clouds, old man, like, hey, I wish I could go back to the old time. There's definitely a recognition that the internet has impacted a lot of things, including this industry, news, right?
Yeah.
So I agree with him there. Genie's out of the bottle, can't put it back in. But one of the things I think article you had shared with us, and Mike, what you're kind of talking about, was sort of that deregulation of the news at some point, which allowed for these cable news broadcasts and these more, opinion-based, entertainment-based reporting. Kind of bleeds into that democratization that is the internet. So people blame the internet for a lot of things. I think it's unregulated. And I don't know. I struggle with there being gatekeepers on certain things, right?
Yeah.
But I would say, so I'm not sure that's the solution in my opinion either. But I do think there is a level of like irresponsibility and like being able to say I'm going to create a channel and then I'm going to just spout my own viewpoints, and then I'm gonna get people that think like me, and then that's gonna be a news station is not appropriate either. So there's a balancing act there that definitely needs to happen. It probably relates back to that deregulation, when I was either young or before I was born, right?
Yeah.
So I don't even know what happened in that period, right? Because I was a child, right? Seems to be a lot of things like that happened back in the 80s. So
Yeah, and I think I know, right, there was a deregulation act that came out
Yeah, I
in the
think
80s.
So it was
Share it with us.
87,
I think it was, yeah.
And so, you get into that stuff, but I would say the internet can work for lots of things, but it's also tore down it's democratized a lot of different things. It's not just news. And I know I'm going off here, but regulation is an answer to that if the government does step in and say, hey, things have to be more balanced.
Right, and it's all, as far as the internet, it's profit-driven in
Yeah.
most cases, for YouTube channels and someone else creating
How many views, right? Like,
yeah, and the advertisers, if you get a following of X amount of people, now you're getting advertising so there's a lot of money involved in this. So that's what it is. It's profit-driven.
Yeah.
And to make a change on that, to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore, it'd be difficult to do.
I would think so.
The genie is out of the bottle, so.
To speak to what you were saying, so this is from Donna Hopper. She's a professor of political communication, and she wrote that, she's talking on the subject, when did the news become profit-driven? She said, it all changed in the late 1980s when media deregulation was proceeding at lightning speed. President Reagan championed the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, opening the door to one-sided programs. So yeah.
I had no idea about that, right? It's like, oh, I should look into that. I didn't know that was maybe what drove some of this.
And this is only going to get worse with AI, artificial intelligence. You're going to have so much more of that between deep fakes. It's going to get worse before it gets better. It really is.
It's interesting. I was thinking when I was watching that clip, it's like, wow, I wonder if there could be some sort of a body that, where there's the UL seal for electronics or whatever. This is okay. This is safe, right? If there were some kind of a governing body or I don't know what kind of body that when a news source is something that is just news, here you will know you have it. And then as I'm thinking that, I'm like, boy, maybe that will solve everything. I'm thinking about what has happened to Twitter, which I'm not on Twitter, but I read about it, how the blue check was like, oh, good, we know this person is legitimate.
Yeah.
And then Elon Musk took it over and then has been playing with the blue check, like, oh no, we're going to give you a gray check now. And we're actually going to take the checks away altogether. Where for a while, the checks were this thing of like, well, all right, I know it's legitimate, and it's a badge where I know I'm getting something official.
Right.
And just how that can be upended. So the point of thinking of like a governing body, like, no, I'm with Koppel where I'll say, nope, I don't think there's anything that we can do about it, other than,
Right.
educating ourselves and others on, look at these different sources.
And that's just it, because if we did a governing body, people would accuse, oh, they're,
Exactly.
no one's, the genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah.
Now, because we're already in this sort of hyped up,
Conspiracy theory mindset.
right.
Right.
Oh, there's one person on the governing body.
And it just seems, you hear some of these and you're just like, what, how did you even get there? And it's, I don't know. It has to be up to the individual to say, I want professional news. I want something that has standards. And I don't know how, I guess through better education.
Well, maybe a lot of it too. Well, maybe not a lot of it. I don't know all the answers, but I'd say like some of this is also us catching up. Technology has moved really fast. Mike, you just talked about how the AIs are starting, to be like, oh, this is really interesting, right? Okay, well, let's just push it onto the consumers here, as that's how they think of us, and we'll just see what happens, right? But it's like, well, we've just spent the last 20 years like trying to catch up as a people, right, to this fast-paced new technology, and I still think we're like working towards that. Like we're not there.
We're in an adolescent stage, I would argue.
And so like, one of the things I think that's sort of it. It's like, so we're in this catch-up phase, and that's why you have all this, like, people want to hear things that, right, like, oh, I want that safety blanket of, like, the conspiracy theory, or like, oh yeah, my side's right. You know what I mean? And like, because they're just feeling so out of control with every year, more technology comes out that they don't understand, and that we don't know what's going to do,
Right, and I wonder if the AI thing could actually be good, right? Because it seems like a lot of people are worried about the AI. So maybe that's sort of a mirror, because AI came into being with the very words that are, in the universe, in the news cycle, in the internet. AI finds those algorithms and spits out some stuff. Mm-hmm. Maybe it will help us look at ourselves and say, wow, this really? I said that?
What have we been saying? Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know. Maybe that's just a little bit of a Pollyanna.
No, I think AI can be really good, but again,
course.
because of human nature, you have evil people who definitely it's going to be used for evil purposes as well, or cheating, or pushing someone toward your point. So but it could be very good in some ways.
Yeah.
But I think that, to me, my personal opinion, you need more regulation. That's the key, because if it's a free-for-all, Wild Wild West, there's going to continue to be problems. And it's going to get worse and worse, as Ted Koppel said. In fact, I would go as far as, if you look at people running for office, what does it take to run for office? You get some signatures? You get people who get elected to government. What qualifications do some of these people have? So a lot of times, zero. So I think you should start regulating that as well. Our leaders have some kind of actual, minimum requirements to actually seek that office, because that's out of control as well. This is why you have some of these morons in Congress who are like off the wall with no.
It's become a show. It's theater.
It's theater as well. Right.
Reality television has taken into our it's become part of our politics.
Right.
And
Literally, we had a president in the past who was a reality television star.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
And also former actor too.
Right. Yeah.
Think about something else too. It's education.
Yeah.
I know, like, I listened to this one school system where, in order to teach kids how to spot like someone trying to do a scam on them or manipulate them, they would actually teach them how you go about doing that. So that way, the kids would basically learn, like, oh, since I know how to do it, if someone else is doing it to me, now I can recognize it.
Right.
I'm almost wondering if if doing that same thing to, obviously like our generation, we're done. I like to use another word, but I'm trying to keep this PG. But like with the future generations, like, wow, let's teach kids like, oh, if you wanted to steer a public opinion to one thing, how would you all do it? Oh, well, I would do this, I would do this, I would.
Sure.
And it's like we're like repeating history all over again.
Yeah.
I like that because it's also like persuasive, like teach them how to do the persuasive argument,
Yes.
but also critically think, right? And that's like going to be
Exactly.
such a critical piece of like learning things going forward.
I think that's the key. Because as much as regulation I think would be helpful, I think there's going to be so much pushback. Well, who's the governing board? But then how do we educate the masses? Why are we so gullible? And I was thinking about this, that sort of theater sells when we see these cable TV shows and these pundits go after each other because, what was it? I was reading in there's a book called Undelivered by Jeff Nussbaum. He wrote that we are basically feeling creatures. Oh, we're not thinking creatures that feel. We're feeling creatures that think.
Right,
and
sure.
so he wrote speeches for politics, and he said emotion always trumps. He was more or less making it always trumps logic. So
Yeah.
people are going to go to, and so that's what they do. They appeal to that sort of
Base,
thing.
that base
And-
emotion.
Right, because that's how we're wired.
Right.
And so logic kind of, and it almost speaks to like conspiracy theories. We want a story behind why something didn't go my way. My life is this way. I want to know. I want a story behind it. It's almost the same thing you see with like assassinations, like JFK was assassinated. Oh, let's have a huge conspiracy about it because we need to explain why this happened. It can't just be because of some lone person did it, We want a story. So we're sort of wired for stories with emotion,
Yep.
and it gets
You got
taken
it, yeah.
advantage in this sort of news environment. Now they've learned to, anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you got it, and I think that's a very important piece. Is like storytelling is definitely part of our DNA and that emotional appeal.
I want to go back to the algorithms thing again, because I think we need to touch more on that, is you have a population that we're all we log on and these algorithms are showing you what you want to see. That sort of reinforce your viewpoint. And it's not news so much as it is opinion, so that gets lost. So you don't know. So a lot of people don't know that other things are going on. And, I know this is probably a sensitive subject in some circles, but you look at the Dominion case with Fox, they were, Fox is paying out Dominion, what was it, 800 and something million,
just under.
some ridiculous amount. Good for them. But the point is, there was no on-air apology about it, and you wonder, their viewers, will they even know about this?
Sure.
So if we get where we're just tuning into the one thing, or if we're going onto our laptops or phones, and the algorithms are just routing us where we're going to hear what we want to hear, we just become blind to anything else that's going on.
And that's why it is a good idea to get a news magazine or a newspaper where if you read that every day, just quickly, here's what's going on in the world versus just looking at the internet with your algorithm
Cookies and everything.
cookies coming at you. You'll learn a lot about what's going on in the world. But
Interesting. So just looking at the clock, we got to get to our next clip. This one has Jon Stewart, and he's talking with the former CEO of Walt Disney about how do we fix this in the news world. So let's take a look.
Can you do a profitable news organization that also has the strength to cut through the noise in this media environment?
It's almost impossible, really, today. I don't know how you would do it. You'd have to, I don't think you can create a subscription news service that would generate the kind of revenue you'd need to cover news right. And advertising is typically reliant on consumption, so you'd have to really be betting that you could drive huge amounts of consumption.
What would you do? How would you fix it? Or what?
I've thought about it a lot.
If you were going to create it, how would you do it?
You'd have to start completely from scratch, but not because you're trying to erase mistakes of the past, but you're trying to erase perceptions that have been created over time, and you'd have to populate it people with incredible credibility and responsibility and accountability. It sounds very idealistic, doesn't it?
It sounds incredibly idealistic.
But
what,
maybe we need
but
it, I
shouldn't
don't
it?
know.
I still think of that idea of a news organization that is more cognizant of what that business model is, and that maybe there's money to be made that's not as relentlessly hyperbolic.
But I don't know, I just don't know how practical that is.
In terms of, you don't know that that's a winner as far as like, that it could be financially viable.
Well, financially viable is, well, even, yes, but I'm much more interested in whether it would truly make a difference in the world.
I feel like it has to, because I've seen the impact that one news organization has had on the deterioration of it. Somebody's got to generate fodder that's better quality. And it feels like, so I guess what I'm asking you is, will you run that?
You're not the first person who's asked me to consider.
Well, here we are then. So
No, that's what
you
this is
seem to
about.
have an idea for you. You have an affinity for it. You've run these large organizations
People
before.
have presented me with that concept. Yeah, they have.
And?
Well, I haven't said yes to it because I'm not sure how practical it is or
Right.
how effective it would be. I don't know.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
I would kind of make the argument that, like, we watch PBS NewsHour, and I would kind of make the argument that fulfills that. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But of course, because they get some federal funds.
Very little.
But like, on Twitter, they actually label that
Right.
this is a government.
It's so
news
minuscule.
outlet.
Most of it is the
Yes, I agree.
donation
But
subscriber.
that's why, right, Iger says, you'd have to start all over again because of those preconceived notions of
Yeah.
Right.
PBS being this,
You tell people, like, I'm a big PBS fan. Like, oh, I watched PBS NewsHour. Like, it doesn't even click as a possibility in their life of where they would get news from. I just don't think it's just out there. I don't know, and
That's amazing.
I'm just a weirdo. But
Yeah, I mean, I guess I did find that fascinating. Just back to the video real quick. It's like Iger is just like not, he's a very successful CEO and just thinks like there is not a chance that's going to run today's world, right?
Yeah.
And I like John, and I guess we'll get into sort of that how do you solve it stuff, but it's like Jon Stewart wants there to be an answer,
Yes.
right? So he's asking and he's provoking that, and I think you have a very highly successful CEO run a very large organization saying that not just that it's not economically viable, but like who would watch that?
right.
Right.
And that gets into what I started to think about is something of there seems to be some sort of cultural paradigm happening, and it's going one way and another and one way and another, and
But
I
if
don't
you
like
could-
to put them against each other, but
Yeah.
that seems to be what's going on,
But if you could set up some kind of a lost leader, get all the news agencies
that.
together, we're going to have what Jon Stewart's talking about. Here it is, not going to make any money, but all these news organizations maybe they get a tax break to do that. Here it is. This is exactly what, not worry about profit. It's going to be a news agency that's very neutral. It's just they report the news, and there's no right or left or agenda that's in it. That could be done, even though
That's
he's
true.
saying it can't.
That's true.
No money. It's not going to make any money.
It's not
Right.
about money, right?
Purely nonprofit.
Well, the Associated Press, they operate on a subscriber service, not subscribers from us individual consumers, but from newspapers and magazines and so forth. So it's a very straightforward the AP has standards and they have to follow them. So they do that on a news level, but if you
Sure.
bring it down to a direct consumer level, that's kind of interesting.
And in the short term, too, I mean, I don't know if this would work, but thinking about when you watch a program, if there's violence, we'll say the program you're about to see contains, violence and cigarette smoking. If there were a way to get all of the current networks, both cable and, antenna, I guess, is there a technical term for that? Analog? To
Broadcast.
Broadcast,
Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you. Knew that word was there.
It was out there. Yeah.
To get them to agree, for example, if there's one of those Fox shows that is mainly opinion-based, to have a little disclaimer at the beginning. So anyone watching that, the show you're about to see is based on opinion. Same with Rachel Maddow. You know, the show you're about to see has a lot of opinion. And if they want something to be particularly news-centric on those shows, to label that.
So they
Here's
need to
your actual
delineate.
news. Exactly. Because obviously, you know, listening to Iger and Ted Koppel, both of them being like, nope, this is not, it's not fixable. Maybe something like that. So at least meeting the people where they're at, the viewers, so they're, you know, where it's like, well, okay, this is the news part of the show. And because they're going to want to make the money, so that sensationalized stuff will have to stay. That's how they make their money.
Yeah.
Sure.
But make sure that there's something in there indicating that this is opinion, this is news. And with the Fox case, what just happened where Tucker Carlson got let go, and Fox is like, yeah, we're wiping our hands of that. We know he made a lot of money, but things have to change because we just had to pay out nearly $1 billion. Maybe something like that could be an impetus for being like, let's just all agree to put some kind of a disclaimer so that people know what they're getting. I don't know if it would ever be agreed upon, or if people would just,
No, it's a good,
glaze over
Yeah.
when they
it's a
see
good
it.
short-term like solution. I mean, I started thinking about like kind of your Jeff's point about, you turn on the nightly news and you still get that like call to action of like, oh my gosh, something bad's happened. Hello, but at least it's a step in the right direction, right?
Right,
And I think that's
something.
an important part.
Something to start it all, in the right direction, but it's a tough one, for sure.
We will hopefully get through this period. I truly think it's like a adolescence period with the digital age. We've survived other things.
That's the good part, right? I did hang on that myself too. I thought like the good part is humans have been through a lot of things in this time, in our time on this rock. So I think we'll figure it out. But does it get worse before it gets better, right? And that's the part of the problem that we're dealing with.
I agree.
Yep.
Well, let's end it on that positive note. That's good.
There is hope.
Thank you everyone for being here today.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for
Thank you for
having
having me.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Please join us next time when we hope our guest will be singer Rick Astley. Cheers.
So the solution is very simple. You outlaw the internet.
Yeah.
Go back to
got it.
You
paper
unplug it like
newspaper,
they did on
and it's a
the
better world.
High regulation, authoritarianism,
Yes.
Yes, I love it.
and one voice from the government. That'll
Yes.
solve the problem.
How come no one has thought of this before?